Hello friends, James Savage here. I am sorry that I was not able to do my TED Talk this morning about what it means to go home justified in the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. But I'm happy to tell you a little bit about what I found. That means the question is, while going home, what does it mean to go home justified? And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I want to start off with the definition of being justified. In the English dictionary, what you'll find, it means the action of declaring or making right or righteous. The word being used in this passage is dikaiou, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which means to render one right or righteous. So no surprise there, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we're asking, what does it mean to go home being made right? And also in the context of the story, how does that relate to the Pharisee? Because the Pharisee, assumingly, is not going home being made right. And I think the answer to this of what does that mean, or how does that happen, why does the tax collector seem to be justified and the Pharisee not, I think it boils down simply to the word humility. If we look in verse 14, the entirety of verse 14, Jesus steps outside of the story, and he says, I tell you, this man rather than the other, the tax collector rather than the Pharisee, I tell you that this man rather than the other went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So based on Jesus' words, the conclusion is that the tax collector who was beating his chest and asking for mercy was humble, and the Pharisee who was giving this praise to God for what God has done in his life was not humble. I think looking through this passage some more, and even bringing in the idea that the Pharisee was saying the right words. He was saying a prayer that would be a common prayer of thanksgiving, or at least one that was known, one that he was kind of paraphrasing and giving his own voice into, begs the question of, well, why isn't this considered a worthy prayer to be justified by, when the tax collector, he only says a few words. This made me think about Hosea 6:6, where God says, I desire mercy over sacrifice. The ritual of sacrifice and the motions that are required to go through that are not so much the point of what God is asking for, but what God is asking for is devotion and humility. And when looking at the words of the Pharisee, although he may be saying the right things, ultimately he is praising God for things that he is not, including thanking God for not being one of God's own creation who is in the temple with him. There is no humility in the words of the Pharisee, whereas the tax collector humbly is asking for help from an outside source, asking for mercy from God, which again brings me to the Hosea 6:6, that God desires mercy over sacrifice. This idea of humility runs through the book of Luke. Just a couple examples. The Good Samaritan is obviously humbled when beaten on the side of the road and requires help from an outside source to recover. We have in this story with the tax collector is asking for mercy from an outside help in order to improve his situation. And in the next chapter, we read about Zacchaeus, who is humbled enough to give away over half of everything that he has. And even alludes to the fact that he may be one of the lost ones that needs to be saved, that Jesus is there to save. There is a theme of humility that God works, that Jesus works, in the humility of people asking for help by God, who is an outside source. And that's something that we don't find in the Pharisee, because the Pharisee only thanks God without asking for anything, without humbling himself. So, to come back to the main point, I think what it means to go home justified is to go home being humbled enough to ask God for God's grace, because God's outside source of grace is something that one can never get enough of, and something that one will always need. So it all comes down to humility. Thanks, guys.